what I'd like to get you to think about is where this talk sort of fits in with the rest of the talks we've heard today. When we really talk about genetic selection and things like that for our commercial animals that are going to go on, whether they be replacement boars or replacement gilts, that's pretty much done here. Okay, so we've made the decisions on which boars to breed to which gilts and which animals to produce those multiplication animals. And then from then, I like to think about, at least from the sow perspective and even from the boar perspective, how those animals come to that point. There's really a developmental phase, which George alluded to as kind of the imprinting phase, and there's a functional phase. So the functional period is actually how we manage the animals in our production system, and that certainly influences how they perform as adults. But I think we have an opportunity to go back and look at how we sort of look at our animals here and maybe change some things that might set them up to function better here. And so that's what I'm going to try to convince you of this afternoon. There's a possibility. I'm going to talk about some studies we've done and then show you what the results we found and tell you what I think the positives and the negatives are, and we'll go from there. So what I want to appreciate is that I kind of look at the reproductive system as kind of like a car. So the first thing you do with a car is you build an engine. And if you build a big engine, then when you put it in a good environment, it goes fast. And really, it's the period between just before birth and really through weaning is that the engine, if you will, of both the replacement gilt and the replacement boar are developed. Okay, if you really want to talk about the structural components. So this is kind of a cross-section of a gilt ovary at weaning. And at birth, you have this layer of follicles here. And then at weaning, you'll actually see them start to develop. And it's quite interesting that all the follicles a gilt's ever going to have the rest of her life are probably in place at birth or shortly after. She's not going to have any more follicles. She's just going to lose them as she goes through. What does happen during the lactation period is those follicles learn how to be follicles. They learn how to grow and respond to the hormone signals that she's actually going to see as an adult. So they start to develop receptors and things like that. So the engine's built when she's born. She learns how to use that engine a little bit during the pre-weaning period. The situation's entirely different for a boar. The boar's engine is not built, so his testicles look very small. They look something like this. These are Sertoli cells. These are granulosa cells. These photomicrographs are Sue McCord, who did some work with Joe Ford at Clay Center a number of years ago. And this is actually what it looks like at weaning. So you can see there's both an increase in the number of germ cells and the Sertoli cells. And that period is the period from just before birth through weaning, and then even a little bit after weaning in boars, it's a period of very active Sertoli cell mitotic activity. And so basically we believe that the number of Sertoli cells a boar has in its testicles sets the boar up to how many sperm cells that boar will produce the rest of his life. Okay, so it's just a real short, narrow time, but these physiological changes do occur in both gilts and boars. And so what I want to do is just show you some relatively simple studies we've done. One's on a large commercial swine operation. And the history behind that is that this farm system was having trouble with sow longevity. So after they had people go in and look at different things, we went in and looked at different things. And to be quite honest, most of the things that we looked at during that functional period, I thought they were doing well. I thought sow body condition was well, feed intake during lactation was good, there wasn't any problem with breedings and things, yet they were still having problems. And so we begin to think about, well, what if the gilts they're bringing in their system just aren't prepared well enough to function as adults? And then I'm also going to talk about some work that we did at NC State with replacement boars. And again, it was manipulation of the pre-weaning environment, pretty simple ones, but it was just try to prove the concept that if you make a better pre-weaning environment, does it have an impact on the animal's adult reproductive performance? So we'll talk about the gilt study first. It was an 80,000 sow commercial operation. We used just under 2,000 gilts. We restricted the gilts that we used. They were born in litters of 10 to 14, so we didn't really want any big litters or really small litters. What we were trying to do in this study was sort of narrow the birth weight, and I'll talk about why that was important. What we did about a day after birth is we adjusted them to either nurse in litters of 7 or less or greater than 10. The average litter size in the 7 or less pigs is right at 7, and this average litter size here was about 11. If we had extra pigs, we just fostered them off to other animals. And all the sows had pigs fostered on or off, so a sow didn't really keep her biological birth litter intact to try to spread out the effects of birth litter versus nursing litter. After weaning, the sows were pretty much commingled and mixed together in the same barn, not in the same pens, but in the same barns. The study had a boar exposure component. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And then all the sows, regardless of their race, in a small or large litter, were bred for the first time when they're about 240 days of age. So this was standard operating procedures for this farm. Then we monitored how they did through 6 parities. A couple of things that are important when you begin to look at the data. The farm management made all the culling decisions, so if they were culled for a reproductive reason or a lameness issue or a health reason, that's all included in the data set. From our perspective, we considered a female that didn't rebreed within 10 days after weaning as a experimental failure. So we set a fairly high cull criteria for that. Now, the farm kept those females in production and they did rebreed. But you're only going to see the data for sows that met this criteria. And that kind of fits with a weekly production schedule in our system. If you wean on a Thursday and they're not rebred by the following Sunday, then they've missed that week's opportunity. Just to show you what the litters look like, this is about 5 days before weaning. So this is a litter of 10. There's actually 10 pigs, and there's 9 over here, and there's 1 hiding over here. This is a litter of 7. And so you can see that they're not bad pigs. I mean, they're not pigs you would typically cull out for being, I guess, what we call opportunity pigs in some parts of the world. One unique component of this study was we did pick a farm that had a pen gestation system. It was an open gutter flush with feeding on the floor in front. We picked this farm because, in reality, I think that's the way the industry in our area might move toward pen gestation rather than crate gestation. So at least pens for the first 30, crates for the first 30 days, and then pens for the rest of gestation. So here's the longevity data. Let me just set this up for you. Here's a percentage of the ones that started on a percentage basis. So right here was about 800 and 900. And then down here I have their puberal estrus when they were actually bred. And this was some length of time if you picked up that they were bred at 240 days of age. Then we had our farrowing 1, our rebreeding 1, our farrowing 2, all the way through 6 parities. What you're going to see in the blue throughout the graphs are the small litters, lactation size, and then what you'll see in the red are the large litters. Typically what you can see on this farm, this was a pretty typical pattern for this farm. Really they had a lot of loss after the first parity, and at the end of 6th parity they were down around 20% of the sows that actually started. Okay, so that was fairly typical of what the farm did normally. In the small litters, we typically began to see statistical difference right here at the first rebreeding, and then it sort of maintained that difference throughout the rest of the parities. And so by the end of the 6 parities, there were around 3% versus, now let me take that back. It's just under 38% versus about, I think, 16, 18%, something like that difference. Okay, it's sort of sows longevity. These were sows that started here, successfully were bred, rebred, and farrowed through 6 parities. And again, remember that the weaning return interval was about 10 days, so we kind of set that as fairly strict criteria. Other people have asked if we had laxed that, what would happen. It's really quite interesting. This line wouldn't have moved up that much, but this line would moved up by about maybe 5 to 7 percentage points to somewhere in here. Okay, so I'll show you the reproductive data. They're broken down by parity. The reds, the large litters, the blues, the small litters. Really, there weren't any parity by treatment interactions, so the main effects are up here. About 88% for the small litters. This is over 6 parities. And about 83% for the large litters. And this was actually fairly normal for this herd. It ran right in the mid-80s in terms of its farrowing rate. Litter size was actually a little bit down in the experimental units that experimental animals we looked at. Again, you can see that there's pretty much a consistent slight advantage of the the small litters over the large litters. It turned out to be not statistically different, but a trend at 0.07 with about 11 pigs born alive versus 10.5. And so it's kind of interesting. This was on a commercial farm. What I do when I teach students, I tell them to be the boar. And so this is a good example of one of our breeders in North Carolina being the boar, I guess. It's pretty good. But people were wondering, so what sort of mechanistically, or what can you attribute this sort of increased longevity to for something that may have happened back here? Okay. And so if I think about longevity, I usually think about this sequence right here. So this kind of explains it as good as anything from a reproductive standpoint. You have sows that you give boar exposure to. The boar exposure stimulates the release of hormones from the brain. The brain actually stimulates the ovary to produce follicles to grow to produce estrogen. When the estrogens reach the right point, the sows come into heat and they ovulate, and hopefully they conceive and so forth. So that relationship basically is a fundamental principle for longevity, at least for sows coming into heat. Certainly in situations where sows are cold, for not coming back into heat after weaning. So I mentioned we had and I just wanted to remind you is that the sow has all her ovaries when she's born, but it's during this pre-weaning period that the follicles on the ovaries learn how to be follicles, how they learn to produce the hormones that are related to what they'll do as an adult, how well they respond to the hormones that are released by their brain, etc. Okay. So we had a boar exposure component of this study where we wanted to give early boar exposure. And the reason for giving early boar exposure is that we wanted to identify the gilts within each of those populations that would respond early to boar exposure with an estrus event. And there's lots of information in the literature. George and his group have published this. There have been genetic studies that have selected for early age at puberty. And pretty much the consensus of this is that boars, if a gilt can respond to a boar early in her life, she's an early responder, then she tends to have there's a positive association with how long she'll stay in the herd. Okay. So this is a classic example of what you might see if you gave, let me back up, boar exposure at 140 days of age. It's a little bit more protracted when you give it at 180, maybe 210 days of age. But you have a group that responds here, and then you have some that trail this in. If you did it later in a gilt's life, this is more compact, but you still have some early responders and some late responders. In this study, we arbitrarily set the early responders at anything that responded within 28 days of boar exposure. We didn't have a good reason for that. It just seemed 28 days was 4 weeks, and it kind of almost split the period in time in half. Okay. So then in each of those groups, what we did was look at the proportion of gilts. If their lactation litter was a small litter or a large litter, if they were classified as an early responder, if they responded within 28 days of boar exposure. So about 77% of those in the small litter did that, and 53% in the large litters. Here's the litter size on average across the number of parities they stayed in production for the early responders versus the early responders in the large litter. So these are all early responders. So there wasn't a statistical difference, but there was a slight difference here. And notice that with late responders, there wasn't really any difference there. Okay. So I'll bring this back. If you notice that there's a 24% difference in early responders, was 77 versus 53. And then here, in our longevity study, there was a 22% difference here. So I don't think that's coincidental. It could be. I don't know, but I don't think it is. So I think there's definitely advantage of something about being raised in a small litter during lactation facilitates the animal's ability to respond. Perhaps they produce more estrogen into the same response of gonadotropins. Maybe they have a more robust response of estrogens or whatever, but they seem to be able to be more sensitive to the things that come on. That's my explanation, because you get more of them responding earlier to a boar. Presumably the boar exposures perceive the same by all. So probably what's happening there, and this kind of makes sense since the ovary already has all the follicles, during the early pre-weaning period, the early lactation period, before weaning, you're affecting how those follicles are setting up, how they'll respond the rest of their life when they are confronted with adult-like reproductive levels. It's kind of interesting. We've, out of necessity, we've kind of been interested to go back and test some of these things just to see if it's true. So instead of giving, this is a preliminary data from a study that we have underway where we've got piglets that were born in small and large litters. We've gone in at different ages and given them a low dose of PG600. The idea is we want to give them enough PG600 to make their vulva swell, to make the ovaries produce estrogen, but not get them to ovulate. Because if we wanted to go back in later and then give them real Boar exposures, we could get a nice synchronous response, and we did that. And you can see this kind of interesting. At 80 days of age, there's really not much of a response. When you get somewhere between 100 and 120, 140 days of age, and remember this was when we actually gave our Boar exposure in the previous study, you can see that it's a higher percentage of animals sort of responding that were raised in small litters. It kind of plateaus here at 140, because at 160 days of age there was not any change. If you look at the large litters, it eventually plateaus at the same level at 160 days of age, but there's not as many that responded 140 or 120. So to me, that's sort of a classic maturation curve difference between a gilt raised in a small litter, lactation litter, versus one that's not. And so this is really what you're testing is hormone sensitivity. Low dose of PG600, how big of a response do they get? So that's the sow story side of things. At the end, I'm going to come back and sort of bring both of them together. I want to talk a little bit about the pre-weaning management of replacement boars. Now remember that the fundamental difference here is between the boar still developing his engine or his testicles during lactation. When the little boar is nursing the mother, he's laying down Sertoli cells that are going to helpfully produce gametes when he's an adult. So it's a little bit different situation than the gilt. So this is a study that we did at our research farm in Raleigh. We had a fall-born and spring-born replica. Don't worry too much about it because we typically have smaller litter sizes in our commercial industry. We had 6 pigs per litter, and then we had greater than 9 pigs per litter. The same sort of thing. This was with boars. The boars nursed in what we call co-ed litters there on campus. We had both gilts and boars in the litters, so that wasn't an all-male or all-female litter in this study. At weaning, we commingled the groups. So this was a classic example of after lactation, there wasn't any environmental effect because both boars raised in small and large litters were in the same pens. And we could do that from a reproductive standpoint with boars. Then as they got older, we decreased the size, the number of animals in the pen. And then at 20 weeks of age, we put them into individual pens, trained them to collect, and then monitored their semen production until they were about 2 years old. The semen production data I'm going to show you was from about the time they were 8 to 9 months old until they were 2 years old. A picture's worth 1,000 words. So at about 90 weeks of age, this is the testicular size of a boar raised in a litter of 10, which really isn't bad, but really it's not that much. It's really, you can obviously tell the difference from one in a litter of 6. And these boars were basically about the same size. Both of them were probably, at that age, 400, 420 pounds in that range, and then you can see the testicle size difference. So here are the reproductive data, and they were collected weekly from about the time they were 8 months old to the time they were 24 months old. So there was an advantage of about 12 billion per ejaculate. It didn't sound like much, but if you multiply that over sort of 15 months, once a week, it comes up to be, I think I calculated about 900 billion more sperm cells over the lifetime of that boar. Really no differences in some of the classical things we look at for semen quality, motility, normal morphology, acrosome morphology. Some more things, some more biochemical things. Normal capacitation was the same, acrosome activity. We looked, hopefully, to find seminal plasma protein differences. There were slight differences, but they weren't statistical. One thing we do in a smaller setting, we deliberately construct what we call heterospermic mating. So we take a boar that was raised in a small litter, mix it with semen from a boar raised in a large litter. We breed sows, and then we fingerprint the offspring to do paternity tests, and we can get a relative idea of which boar, in a truly competitive sense, sired most of the pigs. How that correlates to the actual fertility that a boar will do, there's some other things involved, but it's a relative comparison of fertility. So when we did that relative comparison of fertility, the boars raised in smaller litters were about more likely to sire the pigs. They sired about 2/3 of the pigs in the litter, whereas the boars from the small litters only sired about 1/3. So it does appear that, at least in a competitive sense, they may have a slight advantage in terms of fertility. So what does all this mean? Okay, so I think it means two things. I think it means that probably during this, what I'll call construction period or developmental period, we have some opportunities. We have some opportunities to change some things or accentuate some developmental events that are going on. And that can have a big impact on how those animals sort of function as an adult from a reproductive standpoint. People have always asked, well, maybe it's just growth. Maybe all you're seeing is the faster growing pigs are better reproductively. And growth certainly probably is a way to measure the reproductive development of organs. I would argue that it's probably a better measure for boars, because when you have an organ developing, it kind of sort of usually has a positive relationship with the animal's body weight. I'm not so sure that it's such a good growth rate or indicator for gilts, because at least from the follicular standpoint, all the follicles are already in place when the gilt's already born. So other things are happening, but they're not producing more follicles. So this is actually from the gilt study. It's just an R-square. We've talked about that before. But pre-weaning gain accounted for about 21% of the variation in our sow longevity. Weaning weight was about 15%, and then birth weight was only 5%, but we didn't expect birth weight to be that great because we deliberately selected litters from 10 to 14 pigs. So we tried to narrow the range over the birth weight range over what you would normally see. So we didn't have a lot of really big pigs, didn't have a lot of small pigs in that study. But the important thing, too, is that there's some other things going on that could influence that, so we don't know about. But that's still a pretty good, those three things we could measure during the pre-weaning period account for just under 50% of the variation. And so from a biological system, that's pretty good. We get excited about that, and statistically, right, George, if we can get 20 to 30% of our variation explained by our model, right? So that's not a bad situation. The other thing is, the other possibility is maybe there's selective growth of the reproductive organs, and they separate from the body weight of the animal during that period of time. And one way that could occur is if you could selectively add mitogens or stimulate the organs to grow. And the interesting thing about the colostrum and the early milk in sows is it's chock full of mitogens, things that would stimulate all kinds of cells to develop. This is photomicrographs from a PhD student that just finished, Kara Stewart. And what she wanted to do is, instead of cross-fostering boars, she wanted to see if she could give boars FSH injections during the pre-weaning period and stop it, say, when they were weaned, and see what effect that had on adult reproductive performance. And she's still kind of analyzing those data. But these are testicles taken from boars at 40 days of age after they were given FSH every other day from day 2 of life to day 18 of life. So from about just after the day they were born. And these are they're hematoxin eosin cross-sections of Sertoli cells. And so you can see that this is a Sertoli cell of one given FSH just for the pre-weaning period at 40 days of age. And this is one from a control that didn't receive any. So you can see the Sertoli cell cross-sections are a lot bigger. There's a lot more Sertoli cells. They have a lot more presumptive gonads or spermatotids in the Sertoli cells. This is the staining that actually shows the same thing. The green actually shows the spermatids, and then the red cells here are the interstitial cells of lady egg. Now, the red cells are supposed to be the ones that are undergoing mitotic activity. And so what George mentioned is probably true. One of the things she found was given mitogens early in life, you increase the period of time over which, at least in boars, mitotic activity occurs in the Sertoli cells and the interstitial cells of lady eggs, which produce the testosterone. So that's a way where you get differential growth, presumably, between the testicle and the body weight of the boar. So those are two reasonable ways biologically that could explain what we've found here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know, and then I'm going to tell you what we don't know, and then I'm going to summarize with things that I think only people in the industry can tell us from this. So I do think that strategic cross-fostering has a potential to positively benefit the adult reproductive performance of both gilts and boars. In sows, you're probably going to I think what you're doing is actually changing how receptive the ovary is to hormonal changes later in life. Boars, I think what you're really doing is building a bigger engine, and it allows them to produce more sperm cells. Just because of the differences of how the ovarian development occurs versus testicular development between the two sexes. What we don't know is how much of a reduction in litter size you need to see this. The idea would be is a reduction in litter size is they get more of whatever's good, there's less competition, and that sets them up to do a good job later in life. Personally, I think from some of the work that I've seen that George's and other groups have done about the influence of intrauterine growth retardation, that maybe the piglet's birth weight could be the answer. Try to show you what I mean by this. So I stole this from George, one of his review articles his group published several years ago. And in this, he can correct me, or Jenny can correct me. What they basically did was surveyed of stillborn pigs. And what they did was they took the birth weight, and this maybe should be stillborn pig birth weight, and they looked at different weights of different organs. And what they saw, and all I've done here is sort of did the linear regression, but you can see there's a clear indication that most of the organs, there's a positive relationship between birth weight and organ development. And we usually think of organs that weigh more, that are more developed, and that's associated with a higher birth weight. Okay, and so I don't think there's any reason to think that the testicles and the ovaries wouldn't be any different than these. Certainly the ovary may actually have a more steeper curve than the brain, because certainly there's brain development after birth, but in the pig there's not much ovarian development, at least in terms of the number of follicles. And so what I did was I took what I call our litter scatter from our farm at NC State, the research farm. And what we do is we record individual birth weights, so we calculate a litter birth weight, and then we take the number of pigs that were born alive. And let me back up a minute. What I'll show you is in the Gilts study that we did on the commercial farm, the average birth weight was right here. It was between 2.5 and 2.8 pounds. And I think most people would classify that as a moderate sort of form of growth restriction or intrauterine retardation. The rule of thumb we usually do is we like to see a 3-pound pig that's born. So anything less than that would be one at risk of being underdeveloped or need, maybe grow slower, things like that. Okay, I'll get done in 2 minutes. So here's our litter scatter. So I think at the end of the day, the way this may come into practice is that we need to understand the relationship between birth weight and then subsequently how animals do. So it could be a situation where we have anything over 3 pounds, they're candidates to be replacement gilts or boars. And then we need to find a lower limit too, and those probably, no matter how well they're managed, may not have the reproductive machinery to be good animals as adults. And then there's probably going to be a range in here where I think there will be strategies that we can rescue some of or recover some of the intrauterine growth retardation. I don't know what these levels are, and they may differ from farm to farm. Okay, but I think that's probably the best scenario I can tell you right now. And so if I were a multiplier or I were a genetic supplier company, there would really be two pieces of information I'd want to have during the multiplication phase, and then be able to retrospectively backtrack that for the sows that go to commercial farms and see how they do. I'd want to have birth weights and weaning weights, and then if possible, sort of try to get an idea of the early responders, but that's very difficult. And then the same thing for replacement boars, although I think that's probably not as critical as the gilts because there's a lot more. Okay. And so I think probably at the end of the day, right here we have a potential, and then how we manage the animal here can influence that potential. And certainly probably there's things that we do from here on here that can measure it as well. So.